Well, Catherine McBride, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Hi, Dan. Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's so much going on in London, US, and elsewhere, but I thought I'd set the scene initially by asking you, what, if anything, have you changed your mind about in relation to trade policy over the last 10 years?
Well, I don't think I've changed my mind about that much. There are a few things that I think were always important that have come to the forefront in recent times, which a lot of people didn't want to look at, especially a lot of people in Australia who were benefiting massively from exports to China. And they just didn't want to look at the fact that China was playing fast and loose with the WTO regulations. It wasn't actually breaking the law because the WTO allows countries to identify as developing nations. So they get to decide if they're a developing nation. And while China probably was a developing nation when they joined the WTO, they're certainly not now. They've got a space program. They're richer than any other country in the world besides the the US rather, and yet they're still trying to pretend that they should have the same benefits from the WTO as Bangladesh and the countries that are definitely very, very poor. In fact, Bangladesh is about to move out of the um, World Bank's uh, definition of developing nation because their GDP per capita has gone above 2,000 US dollars a person per head, and yet China's sort of 22,000, and it's still trying to pretend it's Bangladesh. It's really appalling. And I think that that's something that everyone should acknowledge. Everyone is pro free trade if you are buying goods that are genuinely more efficiently produced somewhere else. But if the goods are subsidized by the government, as they often are in China, and they definitely are in the EU, then that's not free trade. That is that is. Some people try and pretend that it's okay because we benefit if another nation is subsidizing our goods, but
Mm.
that benefit runs out when you discover that they then control the market and start not subsidizing your goods anymore, and you've allowed your own domestic production to disappear.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
we
I
we
think
have
back in the day, Milton Friedman sort of made that argument, right? It doesn't matter if they're subsidized, we get the cheap stuff, they're spending money. Hooray for us, the consumer. So I've read your commentary. You're still a free trader, although you recognize the sort of problems with the system. But you're not on the same page as many in Washington, and wouldn't say you're on the same page as sort of a Robert Lighthizer or this penny the Trump administration, or what? How do you characterize yourself?
Well, actually, I've just recently read Robert Lighthouse's book, which I probably should have read ages ago, and I've been
Good, I've read it.
following. Yeah, I've been following what Trump's been doing for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, I'm very frustrated by how little our own the UK government and many other countries in the world don't seem to have noticed what Trump was doing in his first term. They didn't notice that Biden continued all of those tariff increases in the second term. They didn't understand that all China did in the first term was move its factories to other locations to get around the rules, which is why Trump has this time round put up very high tariffs on other countries. In fact,
Mm.
I'm their biggest cheerleader. Actually, I've been writing extensively on my Substack trying to explain to UK people what's going on, because though they all claim that what Trump's doing is bad, nothing brought people to the table like Trump's threat to not buy their goods anymore.
Mm.
Because every country and every company in every country, if they can sell to the US, they will. That's their target market because the US has no consumption taxes or very low sales taxes by state, but no federal consumption tax. So the US has always encouraged its citizens to invest in, to buy things, to spend their money. Well, the EU desperately doesn't want people to spend money and has massive, massive VAT of between 20 and 28%. The highest country has 28% VAT. So it's shocking to me that they then get all upset about Trump's tariffs. And you're going, well, you're actively discouraging your own population from buying your own goods, and your
Mm.
companies are forced to go and look for clients in America to make a profit. And
Yeah.
they don't see
You
that as
yeah.
being anything wrong with that. That's absolutely
Uh,
perfectly reasonable.
you've been great at calling out the hypocrisy of the EU and other partners that, losing their minds about Trump's tariffs when they have, high trade barriers and non-tariff barriers, which prevent
Mm.
Australians and other people selling their goods into the EU. But I just to push you a little bit more, are you still of the view that kind of free trade should work? It's just that China cheats, and we've got to get the sort of trade agreements right. Or are you of the view that the sort of WTO, China's entry into the WTO, and perhaps the entry of other people into the WTO, most favored nation terms, is not really appropriate or not?
No, I think that the WTO has done well, not the WTO, starting with the GATT, the GATT
Mm,
agreement in 1947, which
mm,
only about 23 countries joined. It was a very small group of countries. Actually, it might have been
mm,
slightly more than that, but it wasn't very many. And all of the ones that did join were relatively, what's the word? Noble, honest, um, upright, and countries that wanted to be considered as a developed nation.
mm,
None of them would have said, "Oh, look, here's a whole lot of loopholes we can maneuver around." Uh, and the US did a phenomenally generous thing by opening its
mm,
markets to the world, which it had never done before. People like
mm.
to talk about Smoot-Hawley tariffs, but they didn't realize the US had had tariffs on for a lot longer than that. It
Yep.
really started with the War of Independence. No, not the War of Independence. Might have been,
Civil War.
actually. Yeah,
Yep.
the Civil War. They started putting out very high tariffs, and Smoot-Hawley only took their average tariff from 40% to 46%, I think.
Mm,
So it was a
yep.
tiny increase. What really caused the devastation was that so many countries decided to retaliate. It was as if,
Mm.
again, they hadn't noticed that the tariffs were already 40% and that adding that extra 6% was going to make virtually no difference.
Yeah.
So they, yeah,
Mm.
sorry, go on.
Oren Cass was on. Oren Cass, who I'm sure you've heard of,
Yeah, I've heard him too.
was on Tucker Carlson recently. And my reading of him and reading around these guys, and I probably pay as much like pay a lot of attention in
Yeah,
a way that many people in the UK and Australia do not. I mean, they sort of have a very
yeah.
sketchy view of what's going on, but they do seem to be kind of wanting to move back to the era of what the Republican Party used to stand for from the Civil War until about the First World War, which is high tariff um, barriers in the United States and low, internal taxes, if not zero sort of income tax,
Mm.
and then money which is used to spend on sort of infrastructure and stuff. And I just don't think people outside the US and even many in the US have really wrapped their head around this. They try and pretend that they're either trying to pretend that Trump's a free trader, but he's just using the threats to get concessions, or they're trying to pretend that you know that he's not serious about it, or it won't be so bad. And I don't know. I just don't think that's the way to read it. What do you think?
Well, I think that you cannot lump everything into one group. And I must admit, I've heard Oren Cass talk a few times, but I've not read his book yet. And I
Mm,
keep saying I must do that, but I've been a bit busy fighting the good fight here. But
yeah.
the uh, some goods you must always make yourself. Most essentially,
Mm,
that is defense equipment. And it is kind of incredible when you look at our list, because my job for a long time within the UK was not actually a job. I was on their scrutiny committee of their new trade deals, and I was the only economist, and my job was to go through the 10,000 tariff lines and look at what we export and what we import and what we could trade with these other countries. And it intrigues me if you're importing the chemicals that are used to make dynamite or the explosives in your latest missiles, that is not a good thing, especially if you're importing it from the person who's most likely to be your adversary in the next world war, which is, of course,
Mm,
China. And that's also the case, not just with the US, but also the UK, in pharmaceutical ingredients. The active ingredients in most pharmaceuticals was being made in China because they're pretty regular homogeneous chemicals. There's no real money in them. There's no uh, you know IP attached to them. Anyone can make them. So you sort of move that production to the cheapest producer. But that also means when COVID strikes and you need to make more drugs, you discover you can't get access to the chemicals you need to make them. So that's another thing we've got to really think about. It's like this sounds terrible, but I know people who live in countries that are a bit dodgy and they have what they call a grab bag under the stairs. And if it ever really, if the proverbial hits the fan, they have something ready to go to the airport. And
mm.
when you hear them talk about that, you sort of think, God, that's terrifying. Then you think, well, what would be in my grab bag? And I think all of our governments have to look at their trade and go, what are our key elements that we must produce in our own country? And what's our grab bag? What do we need when it really goes horribly wrong? And a lot of what Trump is doing, I think, is entirely around that. They've also realized this. They also probably realized it in COVID, but because Trump had already put his tariffs up on China, I suspect he'd realized it a long time before COVID. He'd already worked out that this is going to be a problem for us, and we really need to think about what we should be importing and what we should be making ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of this argument as well, saying that, oh, free trade except for um, essentials or national security equipment. And I think it's the high walls, small garden doctrine that the military people
Mm.
talk about.
Yeah.
But how do you build a tank if you still require nuts and bolts to come from China, or you need shoelaces for your shoes, or don't you need a kind of base industrial capacity in your home country? Not that you
Well,
build everything. Yeah.
I suspect you really need, I think, for trade to work. There
Mm,
there are elements and there are things that we should be making ourselves, or at least the idea of friendshoring, which I think
mm,
took up probably more under Biden than it did under the first Trump administration. But you have to know who you can trust, where you can go, who you can rely on to supply you with goods, and also the way those goods will get to you. I have advocated recently that, in fact, I've written a trade paper about the potential for a US UK trade agreement.
mm,
And one of my recommendations in that paper was that the US could give us security of supply for a whole lot of important things, including semiconductors for computer chips, which the um, TSMC has now opened yesterday its new factory in Arizona to make its high level chips in the US. And these are things that completely collapsed UK production during COVID because we couldn't get computer chips. And without the chips, we couldn't build the whole car. And so we had cars sitting on lots that weren't quite ready to go because they didn't have a computer chip. So there are things like that we can bring from the US. And now I know it wasn't so useful in the Second World War, but right now, the cleanest trade route is across the Atlantic.
mm,
When you look at the number, a Chinese ship coming around various straits, China Sea, South China Sea, Straits of Malacca, obviously past the Houthis through the Suez Canal. You're passing a whole lot of areas that are trigger points at the moment for potential disruption. You're much better to have a straight line across the Atlantic. Um, you know, Hopefully no more German U-boats, but without German U-boats, that's your best option.
Mm.
And that would also work for Canada, Mexico, Brazil, a whole lot of countries. Australia can obviously go out of Perth and come around the bottom of Africa, but there's a whole lot of areas where you've got to avoid. And that's also why Trump is so keen to get back the control of the Panama Canal, because 70% of the trade that goes through the Panama Canal is either going to or coming from the US. It's a major, major trading uh, channel for them, and it's kind of incredible that they would let the Chinese run it. That just doesn't make sense for anyone. So there are
Yeah.
there are a lot of strategic points about who you're going to get things from and where you're going to get them from. How they're going to get to you rather. But there are other issues where you've got to. Uh, it's not just the nuts and bolts in things. Sorry, I'm just trying to think of your whole question again, but it was
Oh,
I know
it's just
that.
like, do you need a base industrial capacity and like rather than just sort of trying to select those particular products or goods and services that you might need if war breaks out. It isn't there something a requirement for something broad? Isn't that? I feel like that's something that's sometimes missed. Imposing a broad base tariff, and then on top of that, hitting China with more or hitting selected countries with more, and that broad introduction of a broad-based tariff in the UK and Australia is something that's simply not being considered at all at the moment, to my
Well,
knowledge.
I see his 10% tariff as, in fact, I have written about this,
Mm,
that basically he's got the world in a position, either on chess you do this, or in as basic as noughts and crosses. You can
mm,
get to a winning position when you can go either way and win, and your
yeah.
opponent can only block one of your moves. So if you've got two moves, and I see
Mm,
Trump presently has this. At the very worst, he leaves 10% tariffs on everything that comes in, which is effectively his goods and sales tax for Australia, or VAT for the UK.
yeah.
Um, and it's only going to apply to imported goods, and it will raise a lot of income. And from a exporter's point of view, I don't think that 10% would make a lot of goods uneconomic in the US. So I think most US people will continue to buy them, and
Mm,
yet he'll be able to get his corporate tax cuts and the other tax cuts he wants to do through Congress, because they'll be picking up additional money through the tariffs on imported goods.
mm,
So that way, he gets some of the stuff he wants without the massive revenue loss, which will also help the bond markets roll over the $36 trillion of bonds that he has to roll this year.
mm,
But alternatively, he forces the world into actual free trade. Now, that's the ultimate goal. And
mm,
the only way you can get some of these countries to take trade seriously is to actually do what Trump's done and and threaten them. I mean, the most fantastic report I've read on trade is the USTR's report on trade barriers,
mm.
and they go through country by country,
Yeah. Beautiful.
and it's really amusing to read when you've got politicians in
Mm,
the UK or the EU complaining about Trump's tariffs. And you're going, well, just read, this is the report of what they think about you. Just explain why you're doing this to their products. What's your benefit of doing this? Um, and no country comes out free, even like Singapore, which most people will hold up as the bastion of free trade. Besides the fact that they have 80% tariffs on beer, which doesn't affect the US because they actually have a free trade agreement with Singapore. But they discovered their free trade agreement with Singapore doesn't allow a lot of service trades.
oh, they
The
brew
US,
Guinness in Singapore, with a refinery there, so that
well,
kind of
that'd be to
explains
get
the.
around the 80% probably.
Yeah,
But the
yeah.
the thing the USTR was complaining about is they discovered if any of a US bank or an insurance company or anyone who wanted to set up in Singapore had to, pretty much like a Chinese company, they had to put Singapore people in control of it. They had to have at least 51% of people from Singapore working there. There was a whole lot of reasons why effectively a lot of US banks probably wouldn't want to do that, because they were basically required to give up control to people in local Singaporeese people.
Yeah.
Um,
On the UK, because that's in the news at the moment, it
yeah,
strikes me, that in a way the UK has had to sort of rethink about trade policy in a way that it never really had to, because when it was part of the EU, when it's part of the EU, it didn't have much of an independent
yeah,
ability to strike trade deals, right? That was the whole point.
yeah.
So just for those who aren't completely following the UK as closely as you have been, what trade agreements has the UK signed since Brexit, and should they be considered a success?
Well, we have signed since they left, and I must say that the tragedy of the UK joining the EU is for 50 years there are now no people in the UK government who really understand trade, and we have no
Yeah.
public servants who understand trade agreements, and they've had to
No, that's
build
right.
that industry from scratch, that whole department. And they've I know a lot of them. They're quite young, bright people, but there's really no experience.
Mm.
So the whole department was being run by a guy from New Zealand, who's unfortunately now gone retired and gone back to New Zealand. But and I don't know who's running it now, but looking at the latest news, which we'll get onto at the end, it looks like they're being run by someone who doesn't understand trade either. Um,
Mm.
so first of all, we did a trade agreement with Australia, which was the most ridiculous one-sided agreement I've read until I read the New Zealand one, which was even worse, which we did
Oh,
a few
really?
months later. Because
In
the
favour of
UK
Australia or in favour of the UK, or
Oh, no, in
which way?
favour of the UK. The UK don't
Oh,
understand trade. They don't understand they benefit from imports.
mm,
They have so that they are lowering their tariffs, which are massive. Their tariffs on beef are like 55%, which
yeah, yeah,
basically
well,
blocked all trade other than we had a very small quota of 7,000 tons of beef for Australian beef into the UK.
mm,
So basically our exports were limited at that tariff-free quota. And then you'll
mm,
find nitwits in the UK saying, "Oh, well, we only import a few thousand tons from Australia, so there's no reason to do a trade deal." And you're going, "No, that's because you put 55% tariffs on anything above that amount." But besides that nitwittery that we had to fend off, um, they will only increase the quantities and decrease the tariffs over 15 years. So
mm,
it's very slowly changing. And last year, we finally saw about 4,000 tons of beef came in from Australia. But it's going to take years before any UK person in the street notices that they have a trade deal with Australia because of
mm,
this very slow um, arrangement. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Australians dropped almost all of their tariffs immediately, with the exception of some cheese and some steel springs for some reason. I wasn't sure why. And they will be dropped over 5 years. So we're about halfway through that now. So, Australia understands that you benefit from dropping all your tariffs, and that's how you benefit yourself in a trade deal. Because people seem to get confused. Tariffs are imposed by the importing country on the importing country's population. It is just another tax on their own people. But
mm,
when I thought that was bad, but at least we got it done, I then saw the New Zealand agreement where New Zealand dropped immediately all of its tariffs and all of its quotas on UK imports. But again, the UK did the same thing and put very, very long, um, red- you know, 5, 10, and 15-year reductions on New Zealand imports, um, both on reducing the tariffs and increasing their tariff-free quotas. So,
mm.
again, the UK population will not benefit from this agreement for many, many
And
years.
this is primarily agricultural goods, right?
Well,
And from
they,
New
from
Zealand
a
and Australia.
From a UK perspective, the UK is a major importer of food.
Mm.
They only produce 60% of the food they consume. It's a small island with terrible weather and a large population, which is getting larger every minute with
Mm.
both legal and illegal immigration. So we desperately need more food, and both Australia and New Zealand are big food exporters. But we've decided to limit the amount of food we can buy from them. And this is
Yeah.
not
So
protecting UK farmers. This is protecting EU suppliers. This is
right.
all about protecting the EU who supply us with
Is that,
things.
is that
We
right? Yeah.
then did
Okay.
a tra- we then did a trade deal with we joined the CPTPP, which should benefit the UK. But again, we had these tiny, tiny quotas given out to be shared amongst the 10 countries in the CPTPP. Um, and if they were agricultural quotas, they were shared amongst the few members of the CPTPP who actually export food, which is
The
even weirder.
Trans-Pacific people who
Yeah, this
aren't familiar with
Trans-Pacific
that
Partnership. Oh, okay.
partnership agreement
Yeah. Yeah, so that,
with the US.
Singapore has no quota on exporting food to the UK, but Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Mexico, Chile, all of the big food exporters do have a quota.
Mm.
I look at these things and I think you're such idiots. You kind of deserve to die. I really can't feel sorry for the British people anymore. I just look at what they're
Like,
doing and I think, if you really think this is good for you, you are an idiot. But it gets
yeah,
worse. It
but
gets worse.
yeah, just one little question, okay, like, because I come from like 5 generations of wool growers, in Western Queensland, and I'm obviously they're very keen to have, very sympathetic to them and exporting more and opening up markets and the rest of it all, and especially because the live exporters in WA recently got their industry destroyed by our federal government. So there's lots of stupidity going around, but there is, I think, part of me thinks, I mean, is it, how do you preserve the sort of farmers in the UK? There's a sort of sympathy that goes, crosses borders and the rest of it. Do we really? Is it really that healthy to see them completely wiped out by cheap imports? If that's
Well,
going to happen, or is that not a real
unfortunate
risk?
well, no. Well, right now, of when I said that we only produce 62% of the goods food that we consume
Mm,
locally, but also our farmers. If you just looked at indigenous food that actually can be grown in the UK, which is not
mm,
a big choice, they still only produce 75% of that. So they're
that-
being, they just don't have the capacity. They don't
mm,
have the farmland. What
mm,
people don't understand about UK farming is they've only got 17 rather, million hectares of agricultural land. And of that, only 6 million is arable land for crops. And it's not great, but it's at least the only land in the UK up in Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, where it is flat and you can get a big tractor around it and you can grow things commercially. But the rest of the country is really suited to grazing. But their problem is they're caught between a desire by governments and people who live in London to keep the English countryside looking like uh, the Haywain, John Constable, um,
mm,
1820 painting. So they don't
yeah.
want to, modernize it all. They all freak out at the idea of removing the hedges, but then they complain that other countries who don't have hedges are able to undercut them. Well, it's a bit like, well, you've got to move with the times if you want to produce things economically. But then their farmers got very used to being subsidized by the EU. And unfortunately, we took away the EU subsidies, which are based on land. And so they just got money for owning a hectare of farmland effectively.
Mm,
Now they get subsidized for environmental protection. So you can actually make more money growing wildflowers and bird seed, which you leave the seed on for wild birds than you can make on wheat, because the government, the people who set this up, we're seriously ruled by people who have never run a corner shop. People who you
Mm.
would not give £10 and say, "Go and buy me a pint of milk," and expect them to come back with A, milk, and B, change. You know,
Mm.
it's just frightening when
I
you
hear
read
you.
this stuff.
They're here too.
But
Don't worry.
they didn't understand that when a farmer might get, say, £700 per hectare for their wheat crop, that's not all profit. You know, most of a huge amount of that went into making that wheat crop, and
Mm.
therefore the profit might be only £200. So if you
Yes,
are
it's
paying
farming.
them £500 to grow wildflowers, that's all profit, because no one cares if there's a good yield on your wildflowers. Doesn't matter. You're just getting paid £500 a hectare for wildflowers.
Yeah,
So
you'd have to
consequently,
milk the wildflowers every morning. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. There's no effort, there's no cost, there's no employment, you don't need a farmhand to do that. You know, they put the wildflowers in and they self seed. You know, so
Mm.
uh, it's it's incredible that they didn't realize that a lot of farmers would take this up, because farming's a business, you know. And if you sit and look at your profit and loss and you go, well, I can put in a lot of effort and make about £200 an acre on my wheat, or I can put in zero effort and make £500 an acre from the government for one of these stupid environmental schemes. Well, what am I going to do? Well, it's an easy decision, which every farmer made. And consequently, the government recently just closed the ELMS scheme because it had already hit its £2 billion cap. So many
Yeah.
people had run into it. So
So the
now they've
EU.
moved
Yeah.
to the other insane thing, which every Australian listening to this should be rolling around laughing,
Mm.
because the World Bank actually did an analysis of all the countries that should use solar electricity, and the UK came second last. It was only beaten by Ireland, which has slightly worse weather than the UK. So we are the worst place in the world to put solar panels, but our government is subsidizing farmers to put solar panels on their land. And so, really good arable land, of which we only have 6 million hectares, is being covered with solar panels because it's flat. And solar panel companies like flat land because it's obviously much easier to put a panel on a flat land than on a hill. So, and the hills often are facing the wrong way, so that doesn't work. So, a country that starts at 50 degrees north of the equator, and most people in Britain don't even understand why that's important, and goes up to 60 degrees north of the equator, and therefore has very damp, dark winters, very long nights, very short days in the winter when we all need
Mm.
power. They are paying farmers to put solar panels on their land. So our arable
Yeah.
land, that we have 6 million hectares, only 4 million of it was used last year for farming.
It
And
sounds
then
only
these,
slightly. It only sounds slightly less crazy than in Australia because they're doing the same thing with our land here, and they're paying farmers to do it. But we do have a little bit more sunshine
at
than the
least you
UK,
get
so maybe
sunshine. At least
a little bit more out.
you might actually, I mean, you could almost do that, I hope, and make money from the solar power rather than relying
Mm.
on subsidies. But the solar
Yeah.
panels in the UK will only make money from the subsidies. They are never
Yeah.
going to make enough solar power to really make that a good investment. Without the
The
subsidy, no one would do it. In fact, they'd think you're a
there's so,
bit crazy.
there's so much. There's no doubt there's native craziness in the UK, but a lot of it originated from Brussels and the
Uh,
EU.
Full of it.
And Brexit was meant to be the ability to allow Britain to get out of it and sort of chart its own course and all the rest of it. But just hot off the press, there has been an announcement, I understand, something called the EU reset. What is that? I mean, some of the reports I've read have said that it's, effectively kind of, you know, um, just basically tossing Brexit in the bin or subjecting the UK again to so many of the laws and regulations of courts and of the EU, and they're giving up fishing rights as well or something. Is that the long and the short of it, or is it?
That is the long and short of it. The fishermen only got back 25% of the UK's fishing grounds after Brexit, and that was so they could do this sort of gradual reintroduction. And that agreement was separate from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is the UK's FTA with the EU.
Mm.
The fishing agreement was meant to be renegotiated this year. And instead, it would appear, and I must say, I'm talking of leaks that have come out of this report,
Mm.
and I haven't had time to read the full report, which I think was probably published while we were speaking today, but I hope it is. But from what I can gather, it would appear that we have signed up to letting the EU fishermen basically steal fish from UK waters for another 12 years, and they seem to have gotten nothing in return. And it's terrible because they have decimated the UK's fishing communities. And these are often in isolated coastal communities that do not have an alternative source of employment. It
Mm.
is the most incredibly short-sighted thing I've ever seen. It's tragic for these people, and seems to have been no benefit gained from this. And no one knows why the Labor Party hates fishermen so much. It's incredible, and most people would consider it to be a really good form of food. Um, and it's something the UK can do. I've just made fun of their ability to produce a lot of other food,
Mm.
and that's all true. Most of this food that you find in a supermarket in the Australia and we get in the UK, but only through trade, cannot be grown here. It's never going to be
Yeah,
hot
but
enough, regardless of
the,
the. But fish
fr-
is a basic
from what I
commodity.
yeah,
They've
from what
got it here. They've got a massive ocean, and it's
makes sense. They're
teeming
an
with
island. Yeah,
fish.
yeah. But
And
from
the
what I can
EU have mainly killed their own fishing industry with overfishing, and now they
yeah.
want to get back to killing the UK's waters as well.
And but reading the again, just the headlines and some of the news reports, it seems to be that the selling point is, oh, it's to sort of regularize trade or to sort of make up for the defects in the original negotiation. Is there any sort of truth to any of that? It's all just a fig
Well,
leaf?
the original negotiation could have been a lot better, but the
Mm,
original negotiation is not the problem with UK exports. The
mm,
biggest effect on UK exports, not just to the EU, but to all around the world, has been our net zero laws, because the UK benefited hugely from having oil and gas in the North Sea, and it also has a lot of coal. But unlike Australia, that exports its oil, its gas, and its coal, the UK has chosen not to do that, and they are taxing the products of the oil and gas industry at 78% now, and they seem to think that that's a fair thing. I can't work out why. And so, two of our biggest companies, both Shell and BP, are looking at moving to the US, which means we won't even get our taxes, corporate taxes, from their profits. And they basically, no one is exploring in the North Sea because we have activists who will stop you from opening the wells, even if you find them and get permission to open them from the government, which is already difficult. So, two wells that are the biggest finds in the North Sea, the Jackdaw site um, and the other one, Rosebank, they took 20 years to get permission from the government to open those wells, and now they're being held up in the courts by activists who are claiming that this will prevent us from reaching our net zero commitments under the Paris Accord or something, even though the oil and
mm.
gas could be sold anywhere around the world and it's not our problem. But that's enough for them to stop that. Now, that's been a
So
big
again, mm,
change in our
it,
exports, but
yeah.
together with that is when you refine oil, you get short chain hydrocarbons as a leftover byproduct, if you like, from cracking the oil to make petrol or diesel. And then those are used, the short chain ones are used in plastics and chemicals. And our chemical exports have also dropped. And then, of course, the UK's whole industry was built around building cars. We're very good at internal combustion engine products, and they're mainly cars and trucks, bulldozers, all those big JCB machines in mines in Australia.
Mm,
They're all British production, but we've made this mandate where we've got to move to EVs. So something that we were really good at making, diesel car exports to the EU have dropped by 97%, I think it is, something like that, over 90.
mm,
Our petrol car exports have dropped by about 63%. And meanwhile, we're never really going to make EVs in the UK very well because we don't make the batteries. We have to import the batteries from China, and China's
mm.
doesn't want to do that anymore. They want to sell us the whole car, which is makes absolutely perfect sense for the China, but it's not so good for the UK car production. But we are making very good hybrid cars, and so their exports have gone up, but not enough to compensate for the petrol cars and the diesel cars that have gone down. So
Yeah.
you know, they're misusing statistics and claiming this is because of the agreement, when what they don't want to admit is it's because of their stupid net zero laws. And by
Yeah.
building a whole economy, which has been built around engines that run on either coal or oil or gas, and we've been doing this for 200 years. We started doing this. The
Mm,
whole economy runs on those three products. And by um, trying to wipe out those products, we're also wiping out our whole economy. And
yeah.
no one in the government is smart enough to work that out. And so when I came to the UK, some of the biggest companies on the FTSE back in the 80s were things like ICI. It's just got broken up, sold off, decimated. And our last
That
big
was the
chemical company, INEOS, is also about to move to the US. All companies are going to move to the US because Donald Trump understands that oil
I
and gas is the basis
I
of
re
everything.
I remember ICI from the early days in China. They were a client of mine at one stage doing stuff there, but yeah. Hey, so the EU,
Yeah,
troublesome people.
yeah.
All our prime minister is currently in Rome at the moment, along with half the world. And there is talk of a trade agreement between the EU and Australia. Is it realistic to expect a meaningful, high quality trade agreement between Australia and the EU?
No, not even slightly. You'll find you'll get really tight quantities on any agricultural goods.
Mm,
They already buy the things they need from you and you sell it to them with no tariff, so that they're buying your iron ore, your bauxite, the stuff they need to produce. Because they like to produce steel and aluminium in Europe, but they don't have iron ore or bauxite. Well, Sweden still has iron ore, and
mm,
Austria has a little bit, but most countries have used up all of their minerals years ago, so that
mm.
they have to import those. But if you turn the bauxite into aluminium, they probably wouldn't want to buy that. They only like using colonies, and they will see you as a colony. You'll never be more than that to produce raw materials. They won't want anything beyond that. And they so that they can make the money in the high value goods. And you will see what we have just seen in the UK with they've tied us into their SPS rules. That's their sanitary and
Phytos
phytosanitary rules.
Phytosanitary, yeah, no, that's
So
a big issue for us.
this is how they block trade, because
Mm,
if your goods don't meet their SPS rules, even though they've given you a trade agreement with, you know, tariff free, quota free trade, they can block your imports. And we've just seen that. This is what I'm so angry about today, and what's happened in the reset is that it would appear that the Labor government has tied the UK into accepting all EU SPS rules. So the EU will now
mm,
make UK rules for them. And that means all of our trade agreements that we've signed and taken years, the last 4 years to get over the line, they'll all be null and void when it comes to food, which is
really?
all that most of those countries can export.
Well, so what does
Uh,
that mean for the Australia-UK, trade agreement?
well, that's what I'd like to find out. I intend to discuss this with a couple of other lawyers who were involved. One
Mm,
lawyer has already told me he expects there to be major lawsuits against the UK because, if nothing else, a trade agreement is a contract. And to agree a contract and then say, oh, but we're allowing a third party to change our rules whenever they like. And therefore, that might prevent you from selling us your goods because the third party didn't like your goods. Because the Australians have already.
What conceivable benefit could the UK
Well,
get
the UK
out
will
of
get no
buying?
benefit. The UK will get no benefit as a country. Our three largest supermarkets have been lobbying government for this because they don't like the fact when we were a member of the EU. EU is not free. We were paying them about £20 billion a year to be a member, which meant that large supermarkets could import goods without paying any import costs. So they didn't even, they still had to fill in forms, but they could basically ship things back and forward. There were no checks at the border. So they want to go back to that because they don't like the fact that they now have to pay for their own costs. They're still happy to keep their own profits. They're not interested in sharing those with the good taxpayers, but they do want the taxpayer to pay their costs. So not only are we going to sign up to the EU SPS rules, it does also look like we are going to contribute, we're going to pay the EU for determining our SPS rules.
So it's de facto. It's de facto.
It's de facto rejoining the EU.
Yeah,
and one of the things that both the USTR report and I believe Australia has complained to the WTO about is that the EU has a habit of changing its rules with quite short notice. So that if you were a farmer with a contract to supply, say, grapes to the EU, they recently lowered their maximum residue limits for chemicals and pesticides. So they suddenly said, oh, well, it used to be 0.05 and now it's 0.03 or whatever. So a whole lot of farmers who'd grown stuff for export have discovered that their products can no longer get into the EU. And they did that to Australia, but they've also apparently done it to the US, and they've done it to the US 3 times now. So the US is really ropeable about this, and I would be too if I was there. Because you can't do that.
It must limit the ability of the UK to strike future trade deals, like the one.
Oh, completely. According to both the trade
they had with the US recently, right? I mean, that must.
Yeah. Well, the US deal had 2 slight bits in it about food. The UK was going to let in 13,000 tons of beef from the US, and the US is going to let in 13,000 tons of beef from the UK. Now, in both respects, this is a tiny amount. The UK imports about 300,000 tons of beef every year. So 13,000 tons is nothing, but that's a kind of token effort. But the big thing is ethanol. The UK now has to put ethanol into petrol. So we, like Australia's had E10 petrol for a long time. Well, that only just came into the UK and is now compulsory. So when you go into a petrol station, you get a choice between E5 and E10. That's your choice. But the UK, as I've said earlier, we don't have a lot of arable land. We don't have very good weather. We can't grow corn at all. Can't grow it. It doesn't grow here. It's not warm enough. So therefore, ethanol is not something we do, okay? The tiny amount of subsidized ethanol happens in the UK. The US has whole states that have double the amount of arable land as the whole of the UK, and they can produce ethanol without anyone in the US missing a calorie. It's just not a problem for them. But we used to put 24% tariffs on imported ethanol, which is compulsory to put into petrol. I mean, it was just another tax. This is just the UK government, because first they tax the ethanol when it comes in. Then they put this petrol duty of 52p a litre onto the petrol. Then they add 5% VAT onto top of all of that. So it's just 3 tax on tax on tax being put onto the drivers of the UK. So that was part of the deal, that we'd be able to import tariff-free ethanol from the US, which was a great idea, if you ask me, and should have been done. I couldn't believe we put such a high tariff onto ethanol. And they did talk about how they would try and do a continued trade deal with other products, such as fruit and
Yeah.
vegetables, and a lot of things we could import from the US. Um, and I think that's why the EU is so interested in doing this reset. And when it was meant to be a defense agreement, it's turned out
Mm.
to just be a way of the EU tying the UK in so it cannot do a deal with the US. I think that's all that's
There
about.
must also be a motivation amongst the Ramonas to say, "We told you so," and that, we're gonna basically get back in a de facto way, even though you voted against it too. I'm sure that's part of their sort of spiteful kind of nature,
Well, it
really,
is
to get back.
they will say that, and they will try and pretend that they're doing it on real statistics, and they
Mm.
will try and pretend that the drop in trade was because of Brexit and not because of the ridiculous laws that
No,
have been passed by
you're you
not
are
just
you
the
are
Labour
all
Party,
You have
you know.
been all over the. I've noted, if anything, and I'll link to at the end of the show, but all of the reports and commentary that you've done are nothing if not detailed and technical in the kind of attention to the data and what have. So it's worth diving into, anyone who is really interested in this stuff. I've only got so much time, but and I'm sort of sorry I feel like I'm kind of rushing you on, but I wanted to ask you, because you're originally from Australia, and are familiar with the trade and scene and business environment here. How should we um, readjust our trade policy in light of developments in the United States?
Um, if I was Australia, I would wanna be very close to the United States.
Mm.
Um, I, um I think in general, I always thought Australia was. We've got a lot of strategic defense agreements with them. We've always backed them in any war. We've been there um, with a token effort mostly, but we've always been there because I think it does look from here that we could be on the edge of a major um, what's the word? Probably war, but hopefully it's less than that. Um, and you're going to have to pick a side. And in the long run, I think you're better off on a Trump-led US side than the Chinese side at the moment, unless China completely changes its um,
Y-
what's the
What,
word? Its
what,
its attitude to free speech and free life in
yeah.
general. I think I'd prefer to be on the US team, if that makes sense.
Well, but I mean, back, and this is way back pre World War II. But there were there's a different trading bloc that Australia and Canada and the UK were a part of, right?
Mhm.
Imperial preference, or
Yeah.
Commonwealth. I mean, is that closer alignment between those parties a possibility, or it just will never work in future because I guess Canada, you know, perhaps too tightly, you know, entwined with the US, and the UK is probably too tightly entwined in Europe. But I mean, that used to be an alternative trading bloc that with common laws and common understandings and sort of friendly trading partners that used to be quite a big block, right? You don't think that's
I'm
possible to survive?
No, I've just written about that. I would actually say that the ultimate group would be to revive the Commonwealth as a trading
Mm,
bloc,
mm,
especially now that the UK's exports are mainly services. And our service, even though everyone is carrying on about goods trade going down, that's because we don't make anything anymore. But our service exports are fantastic. Our service exports are
mm,
going up and up and up, but they are highest with countries that speak English, have common law, use the same accounting systems, um, like the same films and read the same books and all of that sort of stuff, which is the Anglosphere, like it or hate it. That's, who that trade is going to
like,
happen with. And if you look at all of those countries, they also have all the raw materials and all of the fruits and vegetables and exotic food and wheat and, and the UK still gets, in fairness to them, a lot of their goods come in from those countries. Like their
mm,
hard wheat that they use to make bread still mainly comes from Canada. even though the EU put a tariff on it, and since they've done a trade deal with Canada, uh, imports of wheat have gone up and imports from France have disappeared. And obviously, the EU probably want to get that back as well.
Yeah.
And they always bought in wool from Australia with zero duty, but that whole industry, the wooling mills, have moved to China, so that
Okay.
that is an industry that, though you can export wool to the UK with zero tariffs and no quotas, the UK
Not quite.
doesn't need wool anymore. And
Yeah.
that's also why New Zealand had the ability to export 200,000 tons of lamb to the US, which it had ever since in the 1950s. So, not US,
Mm.
UK rather. So that the UK had always connected all of the sort of its primary suppliers.
Yeah, it was
And I'd
actually
love to see
interesting
that get
revived,
reorganized,
and
actually.
it will be hard to put the pieces back together again like they once were. And it was actually, there were strains on it even then back in the day. Hey, just final question, and I could talk to you for
Yeah.
a lot longer and all sorts of detailed
Yeah.
stuff,
We
but
can do this again, we can do it again.
well, it's good to have a like-minded person who's really across the details, but it's, where do you expect things to sort of land in the next 5 years? Both in the States, Australia, and in Europe in regard to trade, or is it still gonna be a bit of a mess?
No, I think that the Trump thing has shown that they really are putting so much pressure onto various countries that they are going to try and land something quickly.
Mm,
The only person who looks like they're going to balk at that is the EU, because the EU are both arrogant and stupid. And that's worrying because they do not understand how they went from the top of the world to the bottom in a
mm,
matter of 20 years, and that it was by their own regulation. And that's frightening. And Mario Draghi, who is an EU insider, has written a whole report on this, and they still won't
mm,
listen. And he's explained to them it's all your stupid regulation. And they see that as their superpower. Um, EU commissioner, I can't name him, has actually come out and said that the US is a military superpower and China is an economic superpower and the Europe is the regulatory superpower. They
yeah.
really see that as their place in the world, is to make up stupid rules because most of their population have nothing else to do. They're all bureaucrats somewhere. In fact, they
Well,
invented the word.
but
So,
other people have to abide by them, like their data regulation and also that some would have
well,
extraterritorial application. It really does impact us, these EU,
yeah, and
regulations in due course.
it's one of the things that most people in the UK who felt that leaving the EU would allow us to get rid of that, and they were a bit shocked to discover that it didn't. That our government has never gone, yeah, we're putting this in the bin, getting rid of this one.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of regulations that we never took the time to get rid of, and it's mainly because a lot of people in Westminster have no commercial experience and do not understand why this is a problem. I did say this before, but I had to sign a contract a few weeks ago, and half of the 10-page contract was all GDPR, data sort of protection rules. And you're sort of going, well, we could have put the contract on one page, but now I'm reaping through all this other stuff because you've got all these silly GDPR stuff I've got to go
The
through.
EU is not a place that produces many tech companies, but they feel obliged to regulate the world when it comes to
Yeah.
key
No, no,
key parts
they
of tech.
don't. They don't have
So it's
any tech companies. They do not have
yeah.
any. It's not none. No,
Mm,
it's not a few. It's none. Zero. They should have nothing
nothing
to do with
measured.
technology.
Mm,
They're trying to align the UK, I'll finish on this note, with the
mm.
EU's IP regulations, intellectual property. And when someone asked me about it, I said, they haven't invented anything for the last 100 years, or maybe the last 50, except for the connection of the bottle cap onto the bottle, which
Oh, that's yeah,
people
I
said
do
to
know
me,
about that. We've
yeah,
been spared that in Australia for now. Probably until we sign an agreement with the EU, then we'll have
yeah,
to,
this is
um
their great invention in the last 50 years, and it
yeah.
means that some of the drink gets stuck in the bottle and then it dribbles down the side and it gets all over your hands.
Yes.
It is, and
Poppy
even
Coco
the
was telling me about this and bemoaning it, just the other day.
but also the different plastics mean it's really hard for recyclers. So all the recycling companies are upset about it too, because they have to cut the top of the bottle now to get the plastic they can recycle, and this is now put in the bin. It can't be recycled because it's
It's
attached to the,
it's good to
you know.
it's good to have these clear examples of stupidity in trade
Yeah, and
policy so that you can
and yet
get
they
through to the
want
average
to
person.
determine UK IP rules, and it's like, you well, invent something first, and then we can talk about it.
There
But,
you
you know,
go.
they've
I
invented nothing, and they're trying to just using gene-edited crops now with this new reset. They're gonna put that whole industry of the UK in the bin as well. It's so appalling. Uh, Please stay free,
well, look,
Australia. My only hope.
uh,
I still got a
uh,
passport.
I you know, I could talk to you for hours, and many people do talk to you for hours to get your
Yeah,
detailed advice on different trade agreements. And the thing I appreciate is, you know, it's not just abstract discussion about trade, but it's the nitty gritty where the rubber hits the road that where you provide, you know, a lot of value because you go through them line by line. Um, I will drop all the details regarding your Substack and your Twitter account and everything else for people to check out. But lovely to chat to you, and I'm sure
great.
we'll chat again in the future at some stage.
I hope we do. Thank you very much, Dan. It was a pleasure. Now I'm gonna go and
Cheers,
read the reset. Bye.
man. Ciao. Bye.